Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erica Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erica Mayall, and today I am joined by Maria Tanielian, and I'm super excited to get into a chat with her around all things sport nutrition and specifically dance nutrition. Maria is a registered sports dietitian with a diploma in sports nutrition from the International Olympic Committee, and she specializes in artistic athletes like dancers, as well as endurance and team sport athletes. With over 2 decades of training in ballet and folk dance herself, she combines lived experience with clinical expertise to support performers of many styles and levels, ranging from recreational to vocational students to professional dancers. Maria's approach focuses on fueling for optimal recovery or optimal performance, injury prevention and recovery, and building a healthy relationship with food. Dedicated to bringing research and practice, Maria strives to empower athletes to achieve resilience, artistry, and true well-being as performers and artists. So welcome to the podcast, Maria. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. So when it comes to fueling and nutrition for dancers, there are definitely so many different areas that we could dive into and discuss. But today we're really going to focus specifically on sort of rehabilitation and recovery and how we can use nutrition if we are experiencing an injury or sort of rehabbing from an injury. But before we get into that, I want to go back all the way to young Maria, and I would love to hear what your earliest memories of dance are or how you got involved in the dance community.
Honestly, I love this answer because I love this question. Because if you were to ask my mom, like I've been dancing since before I could walk, she would say. So if you want to go back all the way, like that's pretty as far back as you can pretty much go. Before I could even walk, I was just like holding onto the couch and like jamming. We would go to the living room together. She would put on some music and we would just like dance together. So that would be my like earliest memories of dance. But otherwise, I started dancing when I was like 4 or 5 years old. Some ballet, some folk dance, and I still dance today with my folk group. So it just drives me even further to dive into the work of nutrition and performance nutrition and really seeing these athletes thrive and being treated like the athletes that they are. So that's how I got started. And I'm still there. I don't see myself quitting anytime soon.
Amazing. I love that. I still take class too. So I very much identify with that. I would love to hear a little bit more just about your folk dance background, because we don't hear as many people, like a lot of the people I'm interacting with on the podcast come from a more kind of traditional Western style dance background, ballet, things like that. But would you be able to share just a little bit more about your folk dance?
Certainly. So I am Armenian of nationality. So it's a Armenian and international folk-based dance group. So we also do use ballet as like a base just to, fix up the posture and the arms and the nice legs and whatnot. But it's really a way to, because dance is expression, it's personal expression. But for us, it's also a way to connect to our cultural identity, our roots, our history, our ancestors. So that's a really big driving force and a really big mission of a group like that I'm a part of. But obviously I also love like the Western styles. I am a very big lover of ballet and jazz and contemporary, all those types of things too.
Awesome. That's so cool. Yeah. I'm curious what inspired you to pursue a career as a dietitian, because I know a lot of people who grew up in the dance world, that we often strive to find ways to stay connected with it. And I think sometimes we end up, I know for myself personally, I had experience with injuries and going to see a physiotherapist. And so that was my exposure to that and sort of what led me down that career path. And I'm curious what kind of, drove your direction into nutrition and as a dietitian.
Yeah, for sure. So I was born with like 2 passions in life, dance, obviously, and then in dietetics. Since I was in middle school or even high school, I remember I was always very curious about food, where it comes from, how it's made, how it impacts your health and your body. And that plus being someone who's been physically active for pretty much my entire life, I saw the impact firsthand on energy and performance in sport, which just further drove my interest. I would assume that a lot of dietitians you meet may have a similar answer. I would also assume that a lot of us may have had a particular interest or hyperfixation on nutrition because we may have fallen somewhere on the disordered eating disorder spectrum ourselves. I wouldn't say it's uncommon, but as you get trained, you learn, you know better. You also do better for yourselves, and this gives you firsthand experience to best help your athletes truly thrive in their artistry and their craft. And I would say at this point in time, seeing my athletes truly thrive is really a big driving force for me. Seeing them feel well, perform well, and just be well. Love to see it.
That's awesome. And I'm sure you're not wrong in when sort of saying that a lot of people probably do have that personal experience. And I certainly know that that is true for a lot of physiotherapists who end up in that career path, that we've had our own lived experience. And I'm sure the same is true for dietitians and nutritionists for sure. I also wonder, and this is just me like reaching, and I could be totally off base here, but given like your background in folk dance, and like you said, it's really a way to connect to your culture. I know so often food is a way of people connecting to their culture as well. And I wonder if maybe that also sparked some of your interest in food and where it came from and stuff, just with like connecting to those cultural roots.
Yeah, for sure. I would say it's a very interesting conversation to have, especially for people who live in Canada and in the Western world. I often have to speak to athletes, but also people who aren't consulting for sports nutrition specifically, but just nutrition in general, that our cultural foods also have a place in a healthy, balanced diet. We can also use those foods to fuel our bodies and be connected to our culture and our roots at the same time. It is a very interesting conversation that I often do have with a lot of people, a surprising amount of people. And both somehow I've managed to create a career with merging both dance and nutrition and culture. And it's a very fulfilling and rich career or work, I would say. It's very nice.
Yeah, I love that so much. All right, switching gears just a tiny bit, but can you tell us a little bit more about specifically what sport nutrition is and like the role of a dietitian in sport nutrition? And I personally am super interested in what that diploma in sports nutrition from the IOC sort of looked like, involved, how you kind of went down that path, but really more broadly, just like specifically what sport nutrition is. Because I think a lot of people, hear the word nutrition and maybe think, I don't know, they might have preconceived notions of what that is, but if you can just give us a bit of background specifically on sport nutrition.
Mm-hmm. The best way I could describe sport nutrition in my practice, at least with artistic athletes, it would be a combination of fueling athletic excellence while also fostering a healthy relationship with food, as I think both are equally important and can influence one another bidirectionally. So this would look like using food as one of the critical tools for athletes and physically active people in all spheres of their training, really, whether that's for optimizing energy, brain power, focus, and mental clarity to really make those swift decisions or hit those precise movements, learning to navigate diet culture and unhelpful food culture in general that could drive food guilt or shame, things like learning to manage emotional or stress eating, learning to tune into their hunger and fullness cues, preventing and treating red D or red S, so relative energy deficiency in dance or sport, learning about different foods and food groups, as well as how to build your plates and your meals to align with your own personal training schedule. This is an approach that we call fuel for the work required or periodizing nutrition. And this really is very different from one athlete to the next. That's why it has to be very individualized for each athlete. We also see things like recovery practices in the absence of injuries, just general to keep up the workload, but also recovery in the presence of injuries. So when you're doing your physio exercises and you're not training as much and you really have to actively recover, we also see a lot of that. So practically, that's what it looks like in my day-to-day as a sports dietitian.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's very like all encompassing. And like you said, it has to be such an individual approach. And I think that's one thing that dancers, when we lack knowledge, we sort of go and try and search out information. And this is an area where you see a lot of dancers, and especially because I work with a lot of adolescent dancers where they're seeking out information through, say, social media or things like that. And so the information that they are obtaining, and the same holds true for maybe injury recovery and things like that, but it's probably not necessarily the best information for them individually. So they're seeing, some other dancer post, this is what I eat in a day, or things like tips and things like that, but it might not be appropriate or specific for them. So I think that point about it being very individual is so important for dancers to understand that, the information that you find is what is working for one person out there, but it's not necessarily what's going to work for you.
Definitely. I really do think that social media is an incredibly powerful tool. And I do know a lot of creators who are really doing a lot of great things, a lot of simplifying and making it easy to understand and really accessible. But it's also important to remember that anyone can pretty much say anything on the internet. And it's important to think critically, regardless of who's saying what, and ask yourself some questions just to really see, is this something that aligns with my values? Is this something that makes sense to me? Is this something that I'm curious about and would like to ask a professional for something more in-depth or something more individualized to me, something more personalized? So I do think it's a very powerful tool, and it's a great way for information to get around and to communicate with one another. But I do think it's also at the same time important to remain really critical right in front of all this, to think critically and take what is helpful and maybe leave what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such good advice for everything when it comes to social media, not just around nutrition and fueling, but just in general. Yeah. That I think is really great advice. All right. I am curious what the most common challenges you see are when you're working with dancers when it comes to fueling and nutrition, because I'm sure there are some commonalities across the board. What comes up the most for you?
Yeah, there are a lot of commonalities with dance, like any artistic sport, right? So thinking gymnastics, figure skating, even cheerleading, things like that. But ultimately, the common point that I notice is that the biggest challenge is the impact of actual dance culture on dancers' food choices and their relationships to their own body image and their relationships to food. So previously held beliefs like thinner is better, or dancers need to eat as little as possible, it still weighs heavily on them, despite more and more scientific evidence that dancers actually perform better and are overall just more well when they feel like the athletes that they really are. So some specific common obstacles could include things like apprehension, fear, or anxiety about consuming carbs, right? The fear of carbs, even though it's our body's main source of fuel or our main source of energy for your brain and your physical body. Assumptions that some symptoms of underfueling, like feeling cold all the time, recurrent injuries, poor quality sleep, or sometimes even waking up in the middle of the night hungry, recurrent illnesses like common colds or flus when someone's like constantly under the weather, thinking that these could be solved by non-nutrition approaches, like training even harder or even just taking a bunch of supplements, when actually we probably could benefit from looking at nutrition, making sure it's well balanced and adequate to the training volume. Difficulty organizing fueling opportunities around busy schedules. So students that we see, they have regular school and then dance, or like sport dance. That some of them work, some of them the social lives. They have extracurriculars, hobbies. So they have really, really packed schedules. So sometimes it is difficult to organize this ourselves, but it's something that we see a lot. Now, of course, navigating things like disordered eating, food guilt, and anxiety relating to what they're eating or what even they're not eating, what they feel like they should be eating but aren't. And there's a lot of guilt that is associated with that. There is, I would say, a gradual shift now, however, that I'm very happy to see, things like you and I saw at the Healthy Dancer Conference where we met. So more recognition about like the prevalence and the risks of underfueling and overtraining at the same time. More and more programs in dance schools that really help support dancers' physical health and also their mental health, to ensure just better overall health, well-being, but also longevity in their careers. I think it's really, really great to see too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're on opposite sides of the country. And so we sometimes see different trends, and maybe you're seeing something similar, but I am finding it where I am in Vancouver, I'm seeing much more increased awareness of underfueling potentially, but not intentional underfueling. So not necessarily thinking about the disordered eating, but people just truly not realizing. And a lot of this is like the dance parents and the dance teachers now recognizing much more just how demanding these dance schedules are and realizing how much fueling needs to be a part of it. Whereas back when I was dancing, or even maybe just 5 or 10 years ago, I don't feel like that part of the conversation was there as much. There was maybe a recognition of more of the disordered eating, but not this underfueling just unintentionally because the demands are so high.
Yeah, definitely. I do think it's worth mentioning that underfueling can be voluntary or involuntary, exactly like you said, either with schedules or just lack of knowledge and lack of awareness. I don't know. And a lot of the symptoms that I mentioned earlier of underfueling, sometimes they get confused with other things. Maybe I need a blood test. Maybe I need medication. Maybe I have some other health condition. And it's not always done intentionally. That is very, very true. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Shifting gears just very slightly, we obviously know what some of the challenges are if we're not fueling ourselves properly, but nutrition and fueling ourselves can actually also be used as a really powerful tool to optimize performance. And in this case, we want to talk a bit about optimizing recovery. So when I talk about or think about recovery, there's, just the day-to-day recovery from intense training loads. And this is happening on a regular basis. Dancers are dancing many, many hours a week. And then there's also, rehabilitation or recovery that is happening if somebody has sustained an injury. So if we kind of break those apart a little bit, can you talk to us a bit just about how nutrition might impact just our day-to-day recovery from intense training loads and what dancers want to be thinking about in terms of optimizing that type of recovery?
Absolutely. That's a really great question. Nutrition is a very important tool, I find, in a dancer's recovery toolbox, so to speak, to help repair and adapt. When I work with dancers, I don't just look at what they're eating, but also we have to take into account their entire humanness. Like, it's a whole human and not just a body that eats. And if they train like an athlete, they also have to recover like an athlete. And nutrition it plays a big role in that also. So when their nutritional needs are consistently met, athletes, I find, dancers recover more effectively. They adapt better to their trainings. And this reduces the likelihood of overuse injuries, which is the more common type of injury that we see in dancers. So like those little jumps or just like the things that we do consistently over time. Dancers often also have really long dancing days, multiple trainings, cross-training, class plus rehearsal, plus maybe a performance in the same day. And for multiple days in a row for an entire season, it's not just like one-off busy days. It's often quite consistent. The load is very high. The volume is very high. So this can lead to significant physical stress on the body, things like muscle damage, depletion of your glycogen stores, which is pretty much the gas tank that fuels your performance, fluid losses through sweat, dehydration, and just general inflammation, which is a normal response. I know online now inflammation has become this really, really bad buzzword, but
taboo.
It's taboo and it's a big buzzword now. Everything's anti-inflammatory, but to a certain extent, we do have to remember that inflammation is necessary and important in order to induce the changes or the adaptations that you just did, that you put your body through, because otherwise your body temperature would never come down, or your muscles would never recover, things like that. So it's important acutely in a short term, but on the long term, nutrition really helps address it if we want to keep up that training load throughout the entire course of the season, right? So there's like 5 key things I find that a lot of times help us recover properly in the absence of injury. So this would be just like on a normal training week, month, right? 1 is adequate energy or enough total calories in the day, so to speak. So when athletes underfuel heavy training periods, the body does struggle to repair muscles, restore glycogen stores, and even maintain hormonal balance. Chronic underfueling, undereating slows down recovery, increases your injury risks, and you will feel probably that you're less better able to concentrate during class, pick up combinations, or rehearsals kind of like stunt, not super, super great. Secondly, would be your carbohydrates. They are so important for replenishing your energy during long training sessions. And a lot of times we do I do work with dancers to restore glycogen between sessions when you have multiple training days, just to keep energy up and reduce fatigue. Thirdly would be protein intake, right? At meals, include some at meals and snacks as much as possible. Spread it out as equally as possible throughout the course of the day between your meals and your snacks to help maintain a steady supply of amino acids so it doesn't get too bad for muscle repair. Hydration, that's number 4. Hydration, really, really important role. Replenishing your fluids and your electrolytes through your sweat, especially if it's a really hot day, if it's long rehearsal hours, or if you just tend to be someone kind of like me who sweats pretty quickly and easily. Your body's just made that way. It helps with the perception of energy too. So sometimes you could be fueling perfectly, but if you're not hydrating adequately, you could still feel that lethargy and that fatigue. So not super great. Important to keep hydration in mind. And there are certain macronutrients, this would be like the 5th one, that micronutrients, I apologize, that some dancers tend to be a bit more, they need a little bit more than someone who's not so physically active. Things like iron, calcium, vitamin D has been noticed and studied in scientific literature, but also general antioxidants from whole foods, plant foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, a variety as much as possible. This is going to help support your metabolism, your bones, your immune system, tissue repair during periods of high training stress. So eating consistently, making sure that you have all the key nutrients on your plate most of the time, as much as we can, hydration, and a lot of color on the plate. Practically, that's kind of what that would look like.
Yeah, and that's super helpful just to have those like quick little tips. Just one thing I want to dig out from there a little bit. And again, this kind of goes back to what is circulating right now in the media and all of that. But there is an obsession, which feels like an obsession worldwide, with protein right now. Mm-hmm. And I know in the dance world, like you were talking about before, dancers are often not consuming enough carbohydrates. There might be fear around carbohydrates or not understanding that they really are our fuel. And now what we're seeing in the media that's basically saying protein, protein, protein has become like a little bit. And so what I'm seeing in some of my dancers is we're seeing a bit of that seep into the dance culture as well, where people are sort of saying, I need to increase my protein intake, when in reality, again, not a dietitian, but the reality is those dancers are probably getting adequate protein and probably not getting adequate carbohydrates. But do you want to just speak to that a little bit, what you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. So now I'm seeing, I think 2025 or end of 2024, 2025 was the years of protein, like the protein era. But now there's a transition that I'm seeing towards fiber. And now we don't need protein anymore. We need a bunch of fiber, which is true because colon cancer is on the rise in younger people.
Yes, absolutely.
And but the thing is that, again, coming back to the conversation or the topic earlier about social media, when it seems too extreme, when it seems too good to be true, this is where the critical thinking really starts to happen, in the sense that, do I need protein? Yes. Do I need 200 grams of it per day? Probably not. Right? Do I need fiber? Absolutely. Do I need 100 grams of it per day? No, that'll probably constipate you. So it's really about including the nutrients in an intentional way and in a knowledgeable and informed way. And it never has to be, this is something that I really stand by as a practitioner. It never has to be super extreme or fancy or gourmet, time, energy consuming in order to be nourishing. It could be something really, really simple, but still fulfill the purpose of fueling, of satisfying, of nourishing, and all those things. So coming back to, do I need as much protein as social media is probably telling me? It depends on what the claim is, right? But I would doubt you don't need that much. I don't think so. In the Western world, I would say in general, we don't lack protein per se. In Canada, the States, and just like the Western, more developed countries, I don't see anyone who's lacking in protein if they are otherwise healthy, I would say, right? If there's no underlying health conditions that increase metabolism or, gastric sleeve surgeries or things like that, probably not. But yeah, that's what I would have to say about that. Let's not panic too.
Yeah, that's fair. And like you said, it's like if there's like something you're being bombarded with, chances are it's probably like being blown a little bit out of proportion. I know that companies have jumped on that bandwagon, and now you can get like water with protein added to it or things like that. And it just seems so absurd, but it's gotten a bit out of hand. But anyway, those are really fabulous tips for just fueling for general recovery, like we talked about for intense training loads. How, or I guess maybe the question is, should that strategy then change if we have somebody who is rehabbing from an injury? What I see in my practice a lot of the time is if somebody sustains an injury, oftentimes they're then not training as much. So they're not dancing. Maybe they're sitting out of classes, rehearsals. They might be off for 2 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever the injury is. And so a lot of dancers then sort of adjust their fueling and maybe restrict more. They're thinking, I'm not expending as much energy. I therefore don't need to consume as much energy and all of those types of things. So what should our strategy look like when we are dealing with an actual injury and rehabbing from that?
I would say the principles of recovery kind of stay the same, but injury does introduce a different set of physiological priorities for the body. So while training volume, like you said, may decrease, we're not training as much, we're sitting out of class because of the injury, the body's metabolic demand for healing actually increases. So repairing tissues, immune activity, and management of the inflammation that the injury has caused all require energy, so calories and nutrients, so the proteins, your carbs, your vitamins, your minerals. Healing from an injury is an active process, but it's just happening inside of you as opposed to something that you may see visually day to day. One common misconception is that athletes should eat significantly less when injured. This I see a lot in artistic athletes because of there's this body image puzzle piece there. We want to maintain the physique as much as we can, but in reality, severe energy restriction can slow down your healing. You can lose muscle because you're not being stimulated. They're not being stimulated, but if I'm under fueling, I could lose my muscles at the same time, and then this can make recovery last way longer than it actually has to be. Protein needs often increase during injury rehab, and in terms of quantity, how much protein per meal per day. This is very, very different from one person to the next. It could look like anywhere between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight. So this is tremendously different from one person to the next. It depends ultimately on the game plan from their sports medicine doctor, physio, all these things, right? But ultimately, protein is still important to have to help preserve muscle mass and support tissue repair. And on top of that, nutrients involved in tissue healing are things like vitamin C, zinc, collagen-forming amino acids, omega-3 fatty acids, so the things that come from fish or chia seeds, flax seeds, healthy nuts and seeds. These all play a role in recovery. So it doesn't tremendously differ from traditional recovery in the sense that I still need to eat enough. I still need to eat a variety of foods, proteins, high fiber carbs, starchy vegetables. I might need to prioritize the non-starchy fruits and vegetables a little bit more because I don't have that many energy demands in terms of physical activity, but it's still doing something in terms of rehab for my injury. The carbs shift depending on the training load, but ultimately remain important for rehab and immune function, and also a lot of satisfaction, right? So we don't want to dive into the food cravings, the sugary cravings from restricting at main in terms of calories. Hydration also stays important, even though I'm not sweating as much, but we can imagine it as like your water is probably going to help your nutrients get to where they need to go from the bloodstream. So that's also important because dehydration can also impair healing. And ultimately, the goal to injury or during injury is to support healing while minimizing muscle loss as much as possible and maintaining your overall health so the athlete can return or the dancer can return to training safely and effectively as soon as physically possible. That's kind of how it shifts. So the core principles, I would say, stay very similar, but we do have to be a little bit more mindful about certain things.
Absolutely. And then just in terms of some of the micronutrients that you mentioned there, do you ever, and again, I realize this is going to be so individual, so this is not medical advice, but a question that often comes up is, should I be taking supplements? And people often hear about different supplements, and some of them maybe not so research-backed, but I'm just curious if there are, especially when we're like recovering from an injury, if there are supplements that sometimes are recommended, again, not medical advice, but just in general.
Yeah. So the approach that we generally take as sports dietitians is food first, but not necessarily always food only. So let's say someone is iron deficient. Sometimes iron tablets or infusions might be necessary or helpful, but we try to get most, if not all of the nutrients through food first. So sports supplements, for example, that have been studied for injury recovery are collagen supplements. So if it's like a tendon injury or like a ligament injury, taking a collagen supplement because your tendons are mostly made of collagen 20 to 30 minutes before the start of your physio exercises, because it increases blood flow in that specific area. The belief is that it can take the collagen to that area and facilitate recovery. Ultimately, it's not a very harmful supplement. If it helps, we're open to that. Is it necessary? It could be. It could be helpful. We're open to being flexible about this. Is it crucial, life or death? Probably not. But if you can, why not? Other things like creatine supplementation have also been shown for dancers specifically, most helpful in the off season for if you want to like gain muscles and strength train and things like that. But injury recovery, it shows that it can help us maintain muscle mass when we're injured a little bit more than when we don't. So those are two specific sports supplements that could be very interesting to try when taken in reasonable or appropriate doses, not harmful. And that's always the first principle to any nutrition recommendations. At first, I want to make sure 100% that it's not going to harm you. If it can help you, we're open to the possibility of that. But in terms of micronutrients, in the absence of a deficiency or a specific need, we try to go get those through food as much as possible, right?
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think a lot of people hope or wish that there's just like a magic pill they can take, a supplement. And so it is obviously...
Yeah, if there was, I would be a bajillionaire by now.
I know.
But I would keep it a secret. I wouldn't keep it a secret if there was. But
yeah,
ultimately, the secret is that there's no secret.
Yeah, exactly. And so like you said, it is often food first and really making sure and dialing in on making sure that you have that diverse food intake with all of the different micro and macronutrients in through there. So that is amazing. Is there anything else that you want to add that we like have not touched on in terms of fueling when it comes to recovery or rehabilitation? I feel like we've really touched on the key pillars of it, and you've had so much great information of like practical things that dancers can think about. But is there anything we've missed out on that you want to touch on?
I think that covers a lot of it. I do think it's worth noting that having a multidisciplinary team is super helpful when rehabbing from injuries. So go see your dietitian, go see your doctor, go see your physio, but also go see your psychologist if you have one or need one, because protecting long-term health and relationship with food when you're injured, when you're sitting around all day and just like thinking, and if there's like some shaky relationship with food and body image things, sometimes it's worth addressing with a psychologist also, because injury periods can be psychologically challenging. Am I going to be able to recover? How fast is it going to take? Why is it taking so long? It could, like some emotions and difficult feelings can bubble up. And I do think it's helpful to address it with a multidisciplinary team, but maintaining regular meals and a balanced approach can help both physical recovery and just psychological, mental well-being also. So we're considering the person as an entire person, as the human first and the dancer second. Right.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. And we talk about that a lot on this podcast of like, we still have to be considering the human behind the dancer, or the human that is first and the dancer is secondary to that. This has been so amazing and so helpful in terms of practical information for all of the listeners and the dancers out there. If people want to connect with you or learn more, what is the best way that they can do that?
To connect with me on social media, the best way would be on LinkedIn. You can find me, Maria Tanielian, just look me up. Otherwise, I do have a website. It's the proteindietitian.com. So not the protein, it's protein spelled Protean, which actually means versatile. And it's also a wordplay on protein. So the proteindietitian.com. I practice Canada-wide almost in many provinces of Canada, including BC, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Quebec. So if you do need to consult a sports dietitian, I have a form available on my website. But if not, I also have a lot of resources, courses, self-paced courses, blog posts on the website that you can consult otherwise.
Amazing. I will put those in the show notes as well. So anybody listening, if you want the link to her LinkedIn or to the website, those will be in the show notes. And just to clarify, do you offer services in French and English?
French and English and Armenian.
Amazing. I have no idea how many Armenian listeners we have out there, but certainly I think it is really helpful for people to know that your services are available in French as well, because for people on the West Coast, it is harder to find providers who can offer services in French, but I know we definitely have French-speaking dancers who maybe are even from Europe or other places. So services in French and English, I will put those on the website. Maria, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a valuable conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share all your knowledge with the listeners.
That's very nice of you to say. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy and thrilled with the outcome of this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.